Only a fighter knows what goes through the mind before a fight. The preparations, the rituals to mask the fear. Fear of these last moments of uncertainty before it's time to face the crowd. It's 1810 in the heart of London, in Georgian England, and the fight is on. Now, new research is shedding light on the seedy underbelly of the largest and most prosperous city in the world in Georgian times, bringing to life the people who walked its most notorious and dangerous streets more than 200 years ago, revealing a time when women risked terrible injury and disfigurement in savage, illegal fights with no holds barred.
It was a dirty, nasty sport, and these women would have been pretty rough.
They fought with bare-knuckled fists for money and pride, and for the entertainment of a crowd hungry for violence.
These women would have to be tough in mind as well as in body, and not care about their appearance.
There were no rules at all, and it was over when it was over.
Throughout history, men and women have faced one another in personal combat. At close quarters, one-on-one, face-to-face. They fought for honour, to settle bitter disputes, for prowess, to prove courage and skill, and for sport, to win glory and respect. From the pageantry of the medieval tournament ground, through the deadly rituals of duelists on the field of honour, to the savage backstreet arena of the bare-knuckle prize ring. It's these worlds that Fight Club explores. The Georgian period was a time of huge expansion and change. It was a time of near constant war in almost every corner of the globe. From 1714 until the accession of Queen Victoria in 1837, British interests spread throughout the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Australasia, laying the foundations of an empire that would one day encompass a fifth of the world's population. This was the age of enlightenment and reason, yet it was also an age of upheaval. Trade and commerce had brought great wealth to Britain, but the industrial and agricultural revolutions spelled massive change. The majority of working people were newly urbanised in overcrowded industrial inner cities, and the gap between fabulous wealth and extreme poverty had never been wider. Nowhere was this more the case than in the city of London.
London is an amazing city. It became a world city in less than 100 years, and a city that grew from 500,000 people to well over 1 million by the time Victoria arrived on the throne. Lots of people thought it was a monster, although it was minuscule compared to how big it is now. Areas were so distinct and the people differed in each area, and you get this incredible mix and a real sense of dynamism and vibrancy. That energy that was created in the 18th century is the energy that we have about London now, I think. It's still with us, and that's one of the really special things about the city.
Writer and blogger Lucy Inglis is fascinated by the Georgian period and how her home city of London changed and grew through the 18th and early 19th centuries. It was during the course of her research into these times that she first became captivated by the backstreet world of the everyday Georgian Londoners. A world in which lords and commoners alike found their entertainment in bawdy, smoky, crowded theatres and alehouses. or in the dark, cobbled streets and alleyways, which hid a world of gambling, drinking, prostitution, and above all, fighting. It seems Londoners loved a fight, from vicious animal blood sports to bare-knuckle prize fighting. And it's this bloodthirsty appetite which led to the grim spectacle of woman fighting woman on the streets of the richest city in the world. It seems inconceivable now, more than 2 centuries later. It's this world that Lucy Inglis feels driven to investigate. The London Library in St James's Square is one of the United Kingdom's leading research institutions. It's also the world's largest lending library and a vital resource for Lucy's detective work.
Good morning, Lucy. Welcome to the London Library. Do come in, let me show you around. Okay, let's go through to the steps. The library was founded by Thomas Carlyle because he wanted to be able to read some of the riches that you'd see in a national library, in a national collection, but he wanted to be able to take them home and use them at home.
The library stacks are housed in a giant cast steel framework of floors and shelves, which allows air to circulate around the books.
And these grilled floors were one of the first steel structures in London, and they go all the way down to the basement, and the books span the 16th century to the present day, and there's 1 million volumes for you to browse.
95% of these 1 million volumes are available to researchers to borrow, just like any other lending library. They're not hidden away in dusty archives, but unlike a conventional library, the books aren't routinely thinned or weeded to save space. Everything is kept for posterity. This unique collection has been used by some of Britain's best-known writers and historians: Thackeray, Henry James, T.E. Lawrence, J.M. Barrie. Tennyson researched the Maud D'Arthur here.
The shelving arrangement is unique. It was devised by Sir Charles Hagberg Wright, and it's an alphabetical way of dividing and organising information into subjects which are then very browsable. And it's one of the things members like yourself, writers, researchers, people who just love books really value, is the opportunity to be able to browse, because you do happen across things you would never think to look up from a catalogue record.
In researching Georgian London here, Lucy finds she has literally walked in the footsteps of perhaps the greatest writer ever to describe the everyday lives and characters of 18th and 19th century Britain.
We happen to be at H Revolutions, but there is also a H French Revolutions. H stands for history, and that area would have been used by Dickens when he was doing his research for Tale of Two Cities.
It's incredible to think that Charles Dickens did his research here in this building. One of my favourite things about Dickens is that he was a little boy in Georgian London, and that's what he very often writes about. But people think that he is the Victorian author, when in fact lots of it is drawn from characters, people and places in Georgian London.
Using the same volumes and periodicals that Dickens himself may have used in his own research, Lucy is able to put together a picture of the lives of ordinary Londoners and try to understand how it was that brutal prize fighting for women was tolerated. It's difficult now to look back on Georgian times with 21st century eyes. Yet Lucy finds that just like today, it was a society deeply riven with serious social problems, and some things never seem to change.
Alcohol was part of daily life for pretty much everybody in Georgian London and Georgian England as a whole. People self-medicated with alcohol. It was used as a way of getting enough calories in through beer or wine. It was used as a proper medical cure for various disorders. So people were very familiar with drinking pretty much throughout the day.
In the early Georgian period, the kind of alcohol you could afford to drink reflected your status in society.
Spirits had been the preserves of rich men, because spirits essentially meant brandy or fortified wine in the sense of port that would get you very drunk, and those were all imported, so they cost lots of money and ordinary people couldn't afford them. So beer and bad wine were really the drinks of the ordinary folk.
By the 1740s though, there was a new highly intoxicating spirit that even the lowest of the low could afford to drink.
Gin was very much the preserve of poor drinkers. To become a distiller was cheap to set up, and it was cheap to operate. You weren't regulated in the same way that other victuallers or vintners were. Then, because gin distilling can use bad grain that can't be used for beer or bread, then that second-rate grain was suddenly, the government had an answer for it. It could be used, and it was turned into gin.
In the mid-18th century, there was a huge increase in gin drinking across the nation. It became known as the gin craze. Strong liquor that was cheaply produced and cheap to consume was readily available in the thousands of new gin shops that sprang up across London and other British cities, irrespective of a drinker's gender or social background.
And the interesting thing about gin, it was also, gin was sold in gin shops, which were very often people's front rooms, and both men and women set up selling gin, whereas in other alcohol retail it was mainly dominated by men. And so if you're drinking in someone's front room, there's not really the social stigma. You can drink with other men and women can drink together and then get very drunk. And so you had, in a very short time period from the 1720s, this what other people saw as a breakdown in morals and even society itself, with the introduction of this supremely intoxicating substance. So it's very famous that people would have said you would drunk for a penny and dead drunk for 2p.
Former surgeon Mick Crumplin is an expert on medical techniques throughout history. He studied how the health of everyday people in the past was affected by the hazards of the times they lived through.
Discover the past with exclusive history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all from History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to explore everything, from the wonders of ancient Pompeii and the mystery of the princes in the tower to the life of Anne Boleyn and D-Day. Sign up via the link in the description.
Well, I think the greatest impact of gin in Britain, and we know that it had a big impact because the mortality at the end of the 18th century started to fall when there were legal changes to restrict the sale of gin and tax it and so forth. The mortality fell, so it had a significant effect on the British population. It was one of the provision of hospitals, and the relative abstinence from gin made a huge difference in society.
Women or men involved in bare-knuckle fighting, exposure to gin would have been a dangerous hazard, both to long-term health and short-term performance in the prize ring.
Poor performance in any sort of combat or skilled work is enhanced by chronic alcoholism, and gin lane was there, and penny a pint or whatever, it was an easy way to die. Get chronic liver poisoning and stomach ulceration, and as I say, performance was not enhanced in anything they did.
One of Britain's best-known artists of the Georgian period was fully aware of the impact of gin on the daily life of Londoners. William Hogarth produced paintings and etchings which didn't shrink from showing the realities of life on Gin Lane.
William Hogarth was not only one of our greatest artists, he was a social commentator, and that's something he took very seriously. He felt it was his duty to educate people through art about humanity, which was something he felt very strongly about on the streets of London. If you look at his work, very often it's quite exaggerated and it falls into the realms of caricature, but you do get a glimpse of the extremes that were on the streets at that time.
Hogarth's paintings and etchings provide a detailed and profound impression of what life must have been like for the people of Georgian London. Several of his works also show how alcohol combined with another great addiction in Georgian England, once more irrespective of gender or social class.
In the 18th century, gambling becomes this phenomenon. It's almost like a fever. Cards become quite solitary, aggressive games of chance, which, when exaggerated by lots of men sitting around, and women sometimes drinking, they become very absorbed, and that's how these enormous wagers were made. There are lots of debates that went on throughout the city on whether lotteries should be allowed, on whether cards was an acceptable social pastime. So that gambling culture filtered down all the way down through almost every pastime that could be bet upon.
Among the most popular things to bet on were the blood sports.
Everybody would go to cockfighting. You would have the Duke and the poor man, as long as they could pay the entry fee, and they would all enjoy that sport together, which is a great social leveller. It's probably the only one which encompasses every single social class.
It's against this intoxicating atmosphere of alcoholism, compulsive gambling, and the social classes intermingling that tastes in popular entertainment became more and more base and extreme. Bare-knuckle fighting becomes very popular, both as yet another thing to bet on and also as a bloodthirsty spectacle.
Bare-knuckle boxing has always been a thing that happened all the way through the ages, but it became much more of an urban phenomenon at the end of the 17th century, when you had cockfighting, horse baiting, bull baiting, and man against man was just part of the experience.
Bare-knuckle fighting was the biggest sport in England. In the 1820s, it would explode into what became known as Regency Boximania. It was mainly the preserve of male participants and spectators, but, as Lucy has found, it wasn't a world inhabited exclusively by men.
The bare-knuckling was what everyone came to see and to gamble on. That was where the high stakes were played. But it would have been quite unusual for women to go, unless they were quite rough women, to be present at bare-knuckle fights. However, that didn't stop them competing.
Some women fought in the bare-knuckle prize ring. It was always regarded as a bit of a curio, and it seems not to have happened in the Victorian era, or if it did, it hasn't come down to us. But in the 18th century, there was some women's fighting. We even have reports of women fighting.
Yet compared to countless records of men's bare-knuckle prize fighting, the reports of women's fighting are few and far between. Lucy pieces together what's known.
There were mainly two types of women who would have competed as bare-knuckle fighters, and the first is quite a respectable woman, usually married to a sporting man, and their fights were quite heavily regulated, and they held money in their hands so that their fists had to stay clenched, and that then as soon as they dropped one of the coins in their hands, the fight was over. So it was quite a formal sport. However, that's not really the type of boxing that was so massively popular for women in the 18th century, which was the stripped down, hair pulling, kicking, no holds barred fighting that went on in some of the really rough areas of London.
If you knew where and when to look in Georgian London, you'd be able to find the women's fights. Part sporting contest, part grudge match. There was always an element of illicit spectacle about them. They were known as catfights.
Catfighting was very often held on a Saturday or a Monday afternoon, and it would often be women from the same community with grudges against one another. It was always, she has said this to me and I must have my revenge. In the smaller communities, word would get round that one woman had crossed another or stolen her husband or her boyfriend or anything, and then 2 days later they would meet.
It's these smaller communities that give Lucy a clue to find out more about the catfights. Not only who was fighting, but also who was watching.
The main spectators would be people from the surrounding streets. London was very much about neighbourhood communities, and so word would spread out to a certain point, and that local community, anyone with an interest in that community would be the type of spectator. But it was quite well known that near Tottenham Court Road on a Saturday night there would be women fighting.
Just near to Tottenham Court Road, the infamous
Generally to do with disturbances in St Giles in the Fields, and from the Irish community in particular, and also the areas that were very popular for bare-knuckle fighting, which was essentially the corner from Tottenham Court Road and then where it meets Oxford Street, that corner, and lots of these fights took place in that area.
Even in the London Library, written records related to the individual women involved in catfighting are extremely rare, so Lucy focuses instead on the communities from which they came. It leads her to one of the worst areas in Georgian London.
It's very difficult now to look back and to know who was fighting in these catfights, because they weren't the sort of things that were documented particularly well. However, when they are documented, it's usually the Irish community of St Giles that the women came from.
St Giles in the Fields Church is one of the last reminders of this dark period in London's 18th century past. It once marked the entranceway to the notorious maze of rundown streets beyond. It was a no-go area for all but those who had no choice but to live and work there. It was known as the Rookery.
The Rookery of St Giles came about because outside of the City of London, the St Giles in the Fields was one of the very early developments. And at the beginning it was quite grand. So you get these large houses built on the medieval timber frames. And then the fire to the east in 1666 wiped out most of that style of housing. But St Giles remains. So when London is rebuilt, the housing is thought to be generally of better quality, and it's certainly better provided with sanitation and running water. So people want to live in the newer housing, not the older housing. And so these medieval buildings get really run down and dilapidated, and the timbers are blackened through soot and smoke, and they become very rickety and they start to lean into one another, and very often you have struts and poles holding walls apart to stop two houses falling into one another, and they look like blackened nests, the big messy nests that you see in the trees when you get an enormous rookery. And of course there's that sense of them being sinister, and everything that comes out of them is black and dirty and scavenging, and that is why they're called rookeries.
St Giles was just one of several rookeries across London in the 18th century. Others included Old Nichol Street and Jacob's Island in Bermondsey, later immortalised by Charles Dickens in Oliver Twist. Dickens witnessed for himself the squalid conditions on a nocturnal tour of the rookeries, but only with a heavy Scotland Yard escort. They were home to the poorest, most desperate people in London, and they were a haven for criminals. The expanding city needed manual labour, something the Irish of St Giles had plenty of.
In the late 17th century, London was going through the very start of the boom, and they needed physical workers, manual labourers, to fuel this boom. And the Irish, because they were naturally healthy and fit and had grown up in Ireland in very rural conditions, did not suffer from the respiratory problems and general weaknesses that often affected native-born Londoners.
I think if we're looking at the life for womanhood, particularly poor women in the metropolis, particularly in an immigrant population as the Irish coming in or those from Europe, they would have nothing. They would arrive in tatters, and they would make their money by becoming prostitutes or cheap labourers, and any opportunity to make a quick buck by becoming a prize fighter, no doubt would be tempting to some, but that person would have to have an immense physique and be mentally very tough. Her life expectancy normally without fighting would be probably around 40 years of age, and the number of women who died in childbirth or who lost more than half their children, it was a pretty tough existence. So to fight, you'd have to perhaps not have family responsibilities and have fairly low intelligence and a great muscular physique.
Irish men and women in Georgian London would certainly be inured to hard work. They provided the extra backbone needed for a city that was expanding at a rate never before seen.
So the Irish, traditionally, Irish men had always come over to harvest hay around London, in the fields around London, and then they could get into London to have a good time. And this fitted very neatly with the potato crop. So they would plant the potatoes, leave the women behind to watch the crop. They would come over, earn money, and then they would go back for the harvest, their own harvest. But when they started to find work, particularly as sedan chair carriers and paving London, which was going on all the time. I mean, the roads have been very rough, but in the 18th century, paving became a big thing. They tended to stay, and when they stayed, their families came over with them. And so you go from having a large but temporary Irish population, which came and caused trouble but then went home. You have a large stable population, a population that is not going home. And that's one of the things that Londoners found very, very difficult to deal with. They didn't like it. And also the Irish that came tended to be Roman Catholic, and London has traditionally been prejudiced against Roman Catholicism. So you had lots and lots of social routines and norms amongst this poor Irish population, such as the laying out of the dead for extended periods of time, very drunken wakes. Keeping a pig was a sign of the fact that you could provide for your family. So in these extremely crowded courts and slums, people would keep at least one pig, and it was affected the water supply because the mess and everything else, and it was hugely, this behaviour, those two behaviours in particular, the laying out of the dead and the pigs, became an enormous social stigma and a big problem. People talked about it constantly, it comes up constantly in records. So we must now look back and think that must have been pretty bad for them to be so obsessed with it. But if you think about it from our modern point of view, laying out a body for at least a week or even longer, because very often they were so poor that they could not afford the fees to bury that body, and the money would be brought by visitors. So literally the body stayed there until enough money had come in for the funeral. And sadly there are instances where bodies became infectious and infected the people who were visiting, and there were deaths. So these things in the 18th century, when you are getting much more social awareness, public consciousness, these behaviours were seen as threatening to society and literally threatening to health and public order.
The customs they brought with them may have caused friction with the locals, but it was the living conditions in the rookery that provided the greatest enemies for the impoverished Irish residents. It's difficult now to imagine just how squalid living conditions were in St Giles.
I think the disease pattern in sort of close communities where dysentery would be the most common, bowel infection with typhoid or bacillary dysentery. And then there was tuberculosis, which when the census started, deaths and disease in the 1830s, tuberculosis or consumption or spitting blood was the commonest cause of death amongst the civilian population. So you have bowel infection and then you have tuberculosis. And of course many other problems such as lice and occasionally outbreaks of typhus or typhoid. Typhus caused by louse infection, and the rickettsia organism which lives in the gut of the louse can cause irritation to the skin, which when you scratch it, the rickettsia goes into your body and causes the infection with fever, joint pains, unwellness and so on. Typhoid There's a general febrile illness with rashes and unwellness and enlarged spleen. And these were everyday hazards to these people, which we don't see today because we have good treatment for the disease or inoculation to protect us from them.
With little to look forward to, but a life spent in poverty and death at the hands of alcoholism or disease, women fighters were the lowest of the low in Georgian London.
The women who would have fought in these really basic bare-knuckle competitions were fairly dirty in their general appearance, and something like they would have worn probably very basic linen, leather corsets, quite ragged skirts, and the caricatures of the time always have them in very ragged skirts, but maybe not even shoes, to be honest. That's how poor they were. So their appearance was kind of the lowest sort of social strata of the Georgian period.
The locations for the fights were usually the back streets of St Giles, at this time little better than insanitary open sewers. Even before the fight began, there were health hazards everywhere.
Well, I think the environment in which these women would have to fight in the sort of so-called boxing ring or cockpit or pub or anywhere in the street, the whole environment would be filthy. There would be animals, on the street and being kept in the house or in the backyard, and cadaveric material lying around and human excrement, and all this would give rise to a much larger bacterial population in the environment of the combat. And this is why infection, even in a tiny wound, could be so risky. And I think that these women probably would be presumably fighting somewhere between their late teens, but probably not beyond their 30s.
With the majority of fighters being young women, often whose only means of earning a living was prostitution, inevitably the male crowds, fueled by drink, wanted to see more than just the fight.
It was very common for the poor women to fight stripped to the waist, and this of course attracts spectators. Corsets were usually leather because they just needed something that was extremely hard wearing, and if you get a leather corset, you can just swing someone round by it because it's not going to give at all. So there's not really any point in using those because you just end up pulling each other about, and people wanted to see the tits. Yeah. These fights were pretty serious. Lots of damage done to chests and breasts and faces, and hair pulling, and really very aggressive. And it was over when someone gave in. So there were no rules at all.
No doubt it would deteriorate from fisticuffs into grabbing people's hair and clothing and scratching, and it would get out of control very quickly. It would be a very unpleasant contest indeed. And there are many types of injury you can inflict on somebody else, both on the impact of the fist on the body and causing anything from a broken cheekbone to a broken nose to an eye injury to a soft tissue throat injury to a broken ribs, depending on the force of the blow. But for the deliverer, there was also a high risk, because if you hit someone in the jaw or mouth, or there was bone exposed or teeth, there is a veritable soup of bacteria in these people's mouths. And if they were in the habit of drinking a lot of gin and very poor dental hygiene, so most of them suffered with pyorrhea, which is infection around the gums because of lack of proper teeth cleaning and so on. The chance of getting an infection in the knuckles was extremely high, and there would be broken bones both in the phalanges, the small bones of the hand, and in the bigger metacarpals. And if you get compound fractures of the heads of the metacarpals, that will lead to poor healing, secondary infection, even death sometimes from spreading infection from the limb up the arm. And so there were risks both to those being hit, and women particularly had an awful lot of fatty areas on their body compared to men. They were less evident with their muscles, so I suppose a bruising would be very common indeed. It would be very hard to fracture somebody's skull, but possible with a thin skull, perhaps on the side here in the temporal region. Broken nose is common, eyebrows and the bone above the eye driven in, the zygoma or cheekbone driven in and impacted would give rise to deformity, and of course loss of teeth, although being edentureless or without teeth at this age due to poor hygiene or trauma was very common. And then, of course, you have the fractured jawbones or mandible, which might make chewing difficult and such like things like that.
We don't have any records of a fight to the death between women in the Georgian period, but they would certainly have died probably relatively young and from entirely preventable diseases, just engendered by poverty and lifestyle.
Despite such grim prospects and consequences, the lifestyle of a catfighter still held a strong appeal for many young women.
Female bare-knuckle fighters may have been extremely poor, but they also had the ability to earn relatively a lot of money in a very short space of time. I mean, as much, if not more, as they would earn as prostitutes. So they owned that ability.
Yet money alone doesn't explain it. Lucy believes there was something else. Something that ran deep in the closed immigrant community of the Irish.
One of the things that we don't seem to necessarily recognise now is that poverty had its own identity. People were not just poor, they owned their poor identity, and they very often created it. They often could afford at stages in their lives not to dress in extremely ragged fashions, but they continued to do that. There are lots of examples of women in particular who were quite successful as fish women in the streets and that sort of thing, but still maintained this poor identity. It was very much a look on the streets of London.
Such poverty eventually drew the attention of some of the very first pioneers of social welfare. It was the beginning of a change in attitudes to the poor that would eventually bring an end to the ghetto-like rookeries such as St Giles.
In the late 18th century, a man called Matthew Martin was very interested in finding out the causes of being truly poor. And he started on Piccadilly an experiment called the Mendicity Office. And he gave out tokens in the street, and if you came to the office and submitted to an interview, you would receive money. It was pennies, but it changed over time. And so many people came. And he gathered enormous amounts of information on the poor, who they were, where they came from, whether they were married, single, how many dependents they had.
It was this work that for the first time revealed exactly who among the poor were most in need. The very same people who could have found themselves in the catfighting arenas.
Women are about 90% of the people who came. A huge proportion of these women were Irish. Matthew Martin suspected that many of these women had never been married or had just been deserted by a husband who no longer wanted to support the family. And that became an enormous social concern, that the Irish were coming over to this country and were taking charity, which they did take large amounts of charity. And then the big fear that was not only would they either stay here and drink that money, the idea was that then they would leave and go home. There were lots of stories about poor Irish arriving home in Dublin, but with all the charity money sewn into their clothes, because that's what people wanted to believe. And so this social stigma just grew and grew and grew, and by about 1820 it was an enormous problem, even though by and large social conditions had improved massively from 100 years before.
The work of Matthew Martin and the Mendicity Office was decades ahead of its time and set in motion the slow process of social reform that continued on throughout the 19th century. In Victorian times, no-holds-barred bare-knuckle fighting grew steadily out of favour, but especially involving women. Yet one woman's reputation as a fighter still holds high above the catfighters and gutter brawlers, and she was no Irish woman.
Elizabeth Stokes does represent the organised side, the professional side of female bare-knuckle fighting. She married James Stokes, the pugilist, and she made a career of challenging other well-known women fighters. Usually they were women who had other jobs, and they were big staged events. They were advertised in all the newspapers, and Liz Stokes is particularly famous because she was a Cockney. They called her the Cockney Championess. So she's particularly famous for being a Londoner and married to a Londoner. She was originally from Clerkenwell.
Elizabeth Stokes, who became known as Lady Bare-Knuckles, set herself up as a cut above the catfighters of St Giles and the other rookeries. Newspaper adverts for a fight still exist, in which it's made clear that the combatants were properly and modestly clothed. Stokes was no topless catfighter.
In contrast to the very poor fighters, who obviously didn't want to spoil their clothes and were giving a big show, Liz Stokes definitely didn't want you to think that you were coming to see that type of fight. She fought in a close, tight jacket of quite coarse material, short skirt just below the knee, which then would have breeches worn underneath, and pumps. And that was the way that women boxed well into the 19th century. She set that model.
Though the era of modern women's boxing was still more than 2 centuries in the future, Elizabeth Stokes was the first superstar British woman fighter.
I think Liz Stokes probably is the first great female bare-knuckle fighter. She's certainly the first one that we have proper records of. That's not to say that there certainly would have been women who were fighting beforehand, but I think also she sets the bar quite high because she was surrounded by professional men, her husband and his cohorts, who did this properly for a living. So she transformed it into a very marginal sport for women, both socially, culturally and literally, and brought it into mainstream arenas where men competed for money.
The great changes sweeping Georgian Britain continued apace into the early 19th century. The popularity of men's bare-knuckle prize fighting grew to an all-time high at all levels of society, and even the Prince Regent himself was an avid fan. Yet by this time, Elizabeth Stokes was long gone, and the era in which wild female catfights could be tolerated was on the wane. Things were changing.
The high point of the Georgian era is the Regency in terms of art, culture, everything else, and that is when you start to see the decline of women fighting in the public eye. That sort of thing would be frowned upon, rather than a fun thing to watch. Or even a valid thing to watch. It would have been very, very disapproved of. But again, it doesn't stop the bare-knuckle fights amongst the poorer communities still happening, both for money and grudge matches.
Within a few decades, and the end of the Georgian era, prize fighting even for men was in decline, and the women's had completely drifted into legend. With the great slum clearances of Victorian times, the rookeries disappeared, and the squalid London described by Charles Dickens and William Hogarth was no more. Yet the women who fought with bare knuckles more than 200 years ago are still there, just beneath the modern streets, where Georgian London still remains.